pleasure to speak here. Pleasure to be the first to speak this year. So, friends, colleagues, good to see you. Everybody out there, hope you had a good start to 2020. And this is, if I may use the opportunity to advertise the seminar, only one of many, many exciting talks. If you had the chance to have a look at the lineup, many exciting talks to come for the first session of the seminar in 2022. So Volker essentially said everything that needs to be said about me, so I can directly dive into the content of what I would like to present here. And let me share one of my tabs. So I hope everybody can see this right now. Yeah. Okay, perfect. What we'll be talking about today is a project that has been going on at the Oxford Internet Institute for 5 years now. And it would be a bit exaggerated to say that I have a major role in this. The major role in this are really taken by Willy Ledonwörter, who started this project called the iLabor project here at the OII, and his colleague Otto Cassi. They were both puzzled when they initiated the project by a change that was going on that's shaping our labor market today, and that is the emergence of so-called online labor markets. For those of you who are not familiar with the concept of online labor markets, let me just briefly explain. So these are essentially platforms that have emerged, let's say, roughly speaking, over the last 10 to 15 years, platforms like Upwork, like Fiverr, like Freelancer, where people can exchange digitally deliverable services on a two-sided platform market. What does this mean? When we talk about online labor markets, we talk specifically about services that can be delivered via the internet. So they're performed digitally and they're also delivered digitally. I'm saying this because often when people use other terms that might be exchangeably used for digital labor markets, they often talk about the gig economy or the platform economy, which includes online labor markets, technically speaking, but which also includes other on-site labor markets. So, for example, food delivery services or ride-hailing services, where the process is potentially administered online, but the service is being carried out on-site. So that's an important, separation that needs to be made here. We're talking about online labor markets. So everything that's happening entirely online on platforms, again, like Upwork and like Fiverr, to mention two of the probably largest or most actively visited platforms. Why is this so interesting? Because if you think about labor markets, there were specific rules to labor markets. And this is also part of these presentations. This explanation profited greatly from the introduction video that Willy Ledonwörter is giving on the iLabor page. So have a look at this as well if you want a summary afterwards. So labor markets are shaped by specific rules. There's specific metrics that we look at, that researchers, that policymakers can rely on. So you can measure the size of a labor force. You can measure certain wages. You can measure employment or unemployment rates, for example. But now with the emergence of online labor markets, these rules changed. So the rules of the games of these markets, so how people were finding jobs, not anymore so much via, for example, newspaper announcements, but rather via digital means, via online job announcements, for example. And also these platforms, these online labor markets, are changing the way that people, for example, compete for jobs. So on a platform like Upwork, it is usually the case that people post their profile, so they apply with a certain set of skills. Say, for example, they are graphic designers and they have certain software skills that they're advertising and a certain wage that they come into the bidding process. But they also have other competing graphic designers, potentially from all over the world, and then they're competing for a specific project. This is one type of how these platform works, or one typology of how these platform works. And then you have people who want to buy these services. So and then essentially a bidding process starts, and one of these workers essentially wins the project, gets the projects, fulfills the task, and money's been transferred from the buyer of this digital work to the supplier of this digital work, with depending on the platform, a share of the transaction volume being deducted, being covered or kept by the platform. So as these new markets, these new platforms are changing the rules, so to say, of work, researchers and policymakers were left kind of puzzled, because while these markets were growing and becoming more and more relevant for people from all around the world, they ran short of established metrics. So how to measure, for example, the size of these labor markets, how to measure the financial volume that's been transacted on these markets, how to track the occupations that are being shared, that are being transmitted on these markets, how many people work on these markets, do people find their job very quickly, do they have to wait for a long time, are skills very important? All these questions that have essentially been addressed with established metrics on the traditional, on the conventional, better to say, labor market, have now been unaddressed. And that was the starting point for the iLabor project. I'll have the link up here, but I probably will be sharing together with Volker a couple of materials and links afterwards. That was the starting point of the iLabor project. So to measure the previously unmeasured. And essential piece of this project is the so-called online labor index. And the online labor index essentially does the following. It monitors, now since more than 5 years, it's been monitoring the so-called utilization of online mediated platform work. What does that mean? Technically speaking, the online labor index, which was initially constructed by Willi Lindernberg and Otto Kessi, tracks the number of projects that are being posted on a set of very large platforms, very active platforms on online labor markets, and tracks this utilization over time. And this is the online labor index, what you're seeing here. And there are a couple of things that you can immediately observe from this index. So you definitely see that these markets, these online labor markets, are apparently growing markets. If you have a closer look at the numbers, and this is a most recent depiction of the online labor index, you see that the utilization of projects of online mediated work on these platforms has been growing, and has been growing steadily with a pretty impressive, I would say, annual growth of 11 percentage points. So if you could compare this with conventional labor markets, it's in many countries can rarely be seen that labor markets grow with a small two-digit percentage annual change. What we also know from these markets, they are not only growing in demand, but they're also growing in supply. So a recent publication, a recent estimation that we performed concluded that there are, roughly speaking, 160 million registered workers on these platforms, on these global labor markets. But we also observe some interesting trends. If we look at the utilization, and again, this is the demand side of the market, just bear this in mind. So these are the projects that are being utilized by these platforms. We see interesting patterns. So we see an overall upwards trend, but we can also see that there's some certain seasonalities, as labor economists would say. So we see certain bumps. They always occur towards the end of the calendar year, towards the vacation and the holiday period, which is not surprising, because that's also what's happening on, if you look at the utilization activity of conventional labor markets. But in particular, recently, in early 2020, and that's already leading us towards a kind of a case study that you can do with this data, we see a specific, bumpy ride, a specific roller coaster ride with a sharp increase in demand and a sharp drop, and then stabilization again. And this is something that we also studied towards the beginning of 2020, because this is something that we think we can relate to the COVID-19 pandemic. But I'll talk about this in greater detail in a bit. I think before I will get lost in the slides here, I would actually like to show you the tool itself, because this is an interactive tool. So this is the essential feature of this online labor index, that it's providing visualizations and providing data for you, for policymakers, for researchers out there. So I would actually like to stop sharing this and start sharing another window. Let me just quickly see. And this is the online labor index in full action. You can find this on a page that I'll be talking a bit more about later, under onlinelaborobservatory.org. And here you actually see the online labor index, and you see that it's not static, it's interactive. You can actually go inside and have a look at this graph and have a look at the pattern, how this pattern evolves over time. So the online labor index is here called the Online Labor Index 2020. Why is this the case? Because the Online Labor Index was already established in 2016, as I said, on the technical side, very much shaped by my dear colleague Otto Kessi. But we gave this software, this system, a major update in 2020. And I would like to guide you through some of the features that are new. Perhaps maybe there are some of you who already know the conventional online labor index. I would like to guide you through some of the features that have been added to this index, to this measurement visualization of online labor markets. So the differences between the online labor index and the online labor index 2020. And you'll, even if you have never heard of the online labor index, you'll probably also learn some things that have been very typical for the online labor index, the conventional one, as well. So again, we're dividing the market here broadly into a demand and a supply side. And so what the demand side, for example, allows us to look at is the distribution of online labor utilization across countries. So you can share, for example, you can look at these tabs here, and what these show us essentially that while these markets are global markets, so everybody essentially from around the world could participate in this market, given that this person has internet access and marketable skills, of course. So you could imagine, for example, a store owner in London looking for a graphic designer somewhere around the world, and people from Melbourne or Rio or Bangalore could compete for such a job. But though these markets are global markets, there's some countries, there's some distinct geographical patterns here. And one is, for example, that the majority of the demand on these global freelance markets comes from the United States. So we see, for example, here in this visualization that 42% of the global demand, currently speaking, comes from the United States. Though, interestingly, if we look at this over time, which is also possible with this visualization, we see that things are certainly changing. So that the demand from the United States is starting, or has started in 2019, has started to drop and is now on a much lower level than it was before, with 35%. And you can also have a look at this and compare it with other countries if you look at indexed values. And here the picture becomes clear, because where is this demand going? Where is this share, this shifting share going from the United States? And it's going increasingly towards India, interestingly, because for those of you who are familiar with online labor markets, might know that India has always been and is still a major supplier for online mediated work, but it has in recent years also become a significant place where online mediated work is being demanded. There are probably a lot of things that I could show you here, and I also don't want to get lost in the details. I warmly invite you to explore this, but I would love to switch for the remaining talk. I would love to switch to the supply side of the market, and also talk a couple more minutes about use cases here. But the important thing is you can essentially customize these visualizations to a large degree. So you could, for example, add countries like France here and have a look how France been fitting into this picture. If you look if you're interested in France. So interestingly, for example, France is doing relatively well compared to other major economies like the United Kingdom or Germany. And you can, of course, also, that's an essential new feature, download the data, because the ways that we are portraying this here is only one way to portray the data. And there's I can assure you, having been working with this under the hood for a couple of years now, there's much more to explore and much more to be customized depending on your research interest. So feel free to customize the data or pre-select the data and then press the download button. You can download, for example, you could download this time series, but you could also download the entire OLI world. So all the data from different occupations and different countries. But let's have a look for a minute at the other side of the market, because there's some interesting things and interesting recent developments that could be showcased here. And depending on your internet connection, if you're using a video conferencing software like I do right now, it might take a bit of a time, but here we are already. So this is the so-called supply side of the market. Though I have to bring up one word of cautiousness here. When I say supply side, this is technically speaking not entirely correct. We're rather looking at the labor force here, because we are looking at people that are registered on these platforms. I will talk about this a bit more in when showcasing some of the case studies that we where we could apply this data. But what we're looking at here is the people that are registered on these platforms. It's not necessarily the people that are currently active on these platforms, but it does give us an impression of how the labor force, the online labor force, is distributed across geographies. So what we see, for example, here on this map is the distribution of the labor force across geographies and across occupations. And the different colors indicate which occupation is most popular in a specific country. So if we look at the United Kingdom, for example, we see that overall sales and marketing support, the workers are active in sales and marketing support. And this is the most popular occupation among online freelancers, with 22% of the national labor force supply being situated in this occupation. But I would like to show you an interesting new feature that has been developed with the Online Labor Index 2020, so different to the conventional Online Labor Index, and that's the time series slide up here, where you can have a look at how this developed over time. So, for example, looking at the time span between 2017 and 2018, have a look at the world. So the world looks in this time span, so in the first years of tracking online labor workforce, looks very colorful. Particularly in Europe, you have interesting specializations with francophone, so France and so the Latin language countries, Spain, France, and Italy, being focused on writing and translation work, and in particular, Eastern European countries being focused on creative and multimedia work, and countries like Ukraine, for example, being relatively strongly, in this case, focused on software development and tech work, with almost half of the workforce working in this domain. But now, if we move the slider a little bit and look at the last 2 or the last 1.5 years of online labor market demand, we see a significant change. The world has become much more blue. And that's a general phenomenon that we're observing if we're looking at the time series data of occupations. Software development and tech work has become much more popular in many countries. So you see, for example, France and Spain and also the UK were previously countries where software development and tech had not been the most dominant occupation. And now this has shifted to a significant degree. And in Ukraine, you see this, this initial condition perpetuated even more. So we were looking at half of the labor force being engaged in software development and tech work, and now it's more than 70% of the labor force in the last 2 years. So there's a significant shift in terms of occupational specialization around the world. I could also show you a couple of other features where, for example, we're looking at the distribution of this workforce around the world. So how is this distributed across countries? And here, something very impressing, or for those of you who are not so familiar with online labor markets, becomes apparent. Even though these are global markets, so technically speaking, people from all around the world could participate in these markets, we see a strong geographical focus. So we see that countries like India, like Pakistan, and like Bangladesh are really the major suppliers of online mediated work. And this becomes even more nuanced once we look at software development and tech work. Because here for software development and tech work, we see that India alone supplies 40%, more than 40% of the global online freelance workforce, and together with Pakistan and Bangladesh, if I'm doing the numbers correctly. This is more than 60%, so almost 2/3 of the entire labor force supply comes from the Indian subcontinent, from these countries. Another feature that I would like to showcase before moving to the case studies is the tab on female workers, because as these markets matured, researchers all around the world began studying them more and more. And one very interesting theme, or one interesting aspect, just like with the study of conventional labor markets, is whether there is gender equality, or how gender activity, or workforce activity by gender, is distributed across these markets. And here, for example, we see the split up of the workforce by geography, by occupation, and also by gender, because what we're showing here, these bars, is essentially the female participation in a specific occupation and in a specific country. And interestingly, you see, for example, again, many things that you could take away from this, and also warmly invite you to download the data here. But what we see, if you look at this country comparison, is that even though the average participation rate, for example, if you look at countries like the United Kingdom and Ukraine here, the average participation rate is more or less on the same level, also similar to the United States, so roughly between 35, 37 and 40%. You see that within these countries, across occupations, there is a strong difference in terms of participation of female online freelancers. So, for example, it's much more equally distributed here in the United States, while it is in other countries like in India, for example, or in Ukraine, much more nuanced, with a much larger share of the female workforce working in domains like writing and translation. So while on average, roughly speaking, in, let's say, the United Kingdom, for example, roughly speaking, only 1/3 of the labor force on average is female on the online freelance labor force. 2/3 of them, almost 2/3 of them, are female in a specific domain like writing and translation. This is actually a pattern that you observe, across countries. So this is something that is apparently pretty consistent across countries, that this is a domain, writing and translation, where in all of these 4 countries, the majority of online freelancers are women. I'll again warmly invite you to explore more here, but I would also like to seize the opportunity to showcase the page and also the great collaboration that is associated to the Online Labor Index. So the page where the Online Labor Index 2020 is embedded is called the Online Labor Observatory. And again, you find this under onlinelaborobservatory.org. And the great thing about this is that we managed to spark a new collaboration between the Oxford Internet Institute and the International Labour Organization. So this page is jointly maintained and hosted by both the OII and the ILO. So I also can warn you not to get confused with acronyms here, with OII, ILO, and OII. But it makes things rather more complicated if you're working together with people like Otto and Willi as well. But the essential thing here is, jokes aside, is that you can not only have a look at the Online Labor Index, but you can also look at research pieces that have emerged, at least to a certain part, out of the data from the Online Labor Index. And I would like to, in the interest of time, showcase, for example, one of them, and that is the ILO report. So the International Labour Organization has in 2021 issued a major report, the World Employment and Social Outlook, called short VISO report, where they also, or specifically, look at platform work and dedicated one chapter to online mediated platform work. And we had the great chance collaborating with one of our partners, Dr. Umar Rani at the ILO, to contribute to this report. And there are a couple of things that I would like to showcase where OLI data, Online Labor Index data, comes into play, comes into research. So, for example, in their report, they're showing the shift that I also illustrated earlier. So comparing 2018 data and 2020 data, they show the rise of software development and technology work. So you remember the map, the global map, becoming more and more blue, turning more and more blue in many, many countries. And this can also be nicely shown here in this report, with a rising share of software development and tech work. Likewise, in terms of online labor supply, the rise of India, for example. So we see here a comparison between 2018 and 2020, where India is significantly on the rise, or is rising in terms of online labor supply. Many more things to be explored. For example, we also participated in this map where you can have a look at how projects flow from one country to another country. And what this is essentially showing us very, very briefly is that they are very large economies, so very large circles here. And the blue bars show you where the projects essentially come from. And blue in this case means that these projects come from abroad, come from another country, and light blue shows you that this demand essentially comes from within the country. And you see that here in the case of India, a lot of the labor market demand comes from other countries, and it's actually, if you look at the data under the HUD, a lot of this demand comes from countries like the United States or the United Kingdom, for example. So another case that we can make, another study that we conducted, for example, with online labor index data, is and I showed you the bump initially in the online labor index towards the beginning of the pandemic, was addressing the question: how did COVID-19, how did the economic repercussions related to COVID-19 influence online labor markets? And also here, the data from the online labor index proved to be very helpful. And I'll guide you to a couple of slides here, actually in this blog post. So if you want to read more on this, have a look at the blog post that you'll find on the Online Labor Observatory. But also feel, of course, if you're even more interested in this, feel free to have a look at the paper. We'll probably share all of this information afterwards. So when we thought about how the pandemic could affect online labor markets, we theoretically imagined two effects. One was what we called a downscaling loss. So essentially, companies that were affected by COVID-19 would cut non-essential spendings, and often these non-essential spendings are jobs that are performed by freelancers for these companies. So external contractors, freelancers that are doing software development or doing graphic design, for example. And therefore, we assumed that the demand for online mediated work might drop due to COVID-19, or more specifically speaking, due to the economic repercussions of COVID-19. The other side was that we theoretically thought it could also be possible that online freelance market might profit from this natural shock, in the sense that now that companies were forced to close down and send people home, the so-called comparative advantage of online freelancers kicked in. Because usually, at least that's what theory suggests, one of the reasons why employers would like to keep people inside the company, so physically in a firm, is, of course, is supervision. So they would like to see essentially what they're doing. They would like to get with them in direct contact. But now, since this advantage had been erased, we thought that the cost comparison would play a much stronger role. And in terms of costs, it's often that online freelancers, because they manage to leverage global imbalances of wages, that online freelancers should become more attractive for employers. And we call these two effects the distancing, the downscaling loss, and the distancing bonus. And these were, as you can imagine from my description, competing effects. And we had the amazing opportunity to not only look at our data, but also to collaborate with researchers in the United States who had surveyed freelancers specifically in this period. And these two data points, they fitted very, very well together. But let's have a look at the online labor index data. You find more about the interviews in the paper. What we did see is that actually the demand, if you remember the graph, the online labor index, the demand for online mediated work did drop and then started to rise again. But this picture was, and I'm cutting things extremely short here, of course, this picture was to a certain degree misleading, because once we looked at the labor demand, and we're talking about the United States in specific here, we saw that the changes in labor demands were not driven or didn't have the labor demand didn't have the same shape for all occupations. And specifically, while some occupations really suffered, other occupations actually maintained a pretty stable level or even flourished in this period. So what we're seeing here, for example, is the change in demand in this period. So we're looking at early 2020, February, March, April, and May. And we see that for some occupations, the demand for online mediated work dropped, specifically, for example, creative and multimedia work or sales and marketing support. And that for other occupations, most predominantly for software development and tech work, it remained stable and even started to rise. And one of the explanations that we found for this, also talking to leveraging on this interview data, was that both effects actually kicked in. So both the downscaling loss and the distancing bonus kicked in, because some of these spendings, if you look at them by occupation, some of this work was considered as non-essential and was therefore being cut because companies were under economic pressure. But this work was often work like a marketing strategy or designing a new logo, for example. On the other hand, there were also essential types of work that had been outsourced to freelancers. And here the distancing bonus kicked in. And this work was often, and that's following the general trend that we've seen, namely the rise of software development and tech work. This work was often related to software development and tech work, because often the work that firms had outsourced to these online freelancers was essentially relatively essential to what they've been doing. So you can imagine, while it's to put it very simply, while it's relatively easy to say, like, okay, we're on a tight budget here, we have to cut the cost for the marketing campaign for next year. It's definitely much more difficult, depending on what you're doing, the type of services you're providing, to shut down the servers that are maybe maintained, or shut down the dashboards and visualizations that are maintained by some external freelancers that you had hired on online freelance markets. So both the downscaling loss and the distancing bonus kicked in, and the online labor index data allowed us to reveal how this trend unfolded with regard to specific occupations. Let me just quickly switch back to my slides again. So again, I talked about this in great detail. If you would like to find out how this really works under the hood and find out more about the technical details of this work, feel free to have a look at our paper that we just published with Big Data and Society in spring and summer. Actually, no, it was I think it was July last year, co-authored by Otto Kessi Umarani and Vilile Donver-Delmi. Also feel free to scan the QR code if you're familiar with that. That should lead you directly to the publication. And I think I'll try to share as many of the other resources and details that I mentioned earlier with you after this talk. Thanks so much.